The year was 1940. Europe was in ruins. For 9 months the world had watched, helpless, as Hitler's forces swept across the continent like a storm of iron and fire. Poland had fallen first, devoured in a matter of weeks. Then Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands. Each nation collapsed beneath the relentless rhythm of blitzkrieg, lightning war, where tanks, aircraft, and mechanized troops moved as one devastating machine. France, once proud and defiant, had been broken in 6 short weeks. The Wehrmacht paraded through Paris beneath gray skies, their boots echoing on cobblestone streets that had once sung with freedom. The Nazi flag now flew from the Eiffel Tower, a scarlet wound against the city's wounded heart, and so the eyes of the world turned to the last free bastion in Western Europe, Britain. An island fortress surrounded by sea, led by a defiant new prime minister whose words carried the weight of an empire. Winston Churchill, the bulldog of Britain, refused to surrender. In the smoking ruins of Dunkirk, where more than 300,000 British and French troops had been rescued from the beaches by a miracle of civilian boats, Churchill stood before Parliament and spoke words that electrified a nation. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The speech rang through every home, every factory, every airfield. Britain would stand. Britain would fight. But across the Channel, Adolf Hitler prepared for invasion. Operation Sea Lion Hitler believed that Britain, beaten and isolated, would seek peace. He was wrong. When no surrender came, he ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. Yet the plan depended on one condition: control of the skies. Before German troops could cross the Channel, the Luftwaffe would have to destroy the Royal Air Force. Without air superiority, the invasion fleet would be torn apart by British bombers and the Royal Navy. So began the greatest air battle in history. The calm before the storm. The summer of 1940 was warm and golden. Across southern England, children played in fields unaware of the storm gathering beyond the horizon. On the coast, radar stations, tall metal skeletons of a new kind of defense, stood silent sentry over the sea. Inside, small huts filled with glowing screens, the operators of the chain home system watched for movement. They were young women mostly, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, scanning the skies for the first faint echoes of approaching aircraft. It was here, in these dim-lit rooms, that Britain's survival would begin. Not in the air, but in the invisible waves that carried radar signals across the Channel. Oh, the machines of war. On both sides, men prepared their tools of destruction. The Germans had the Messerschmitt Bf 109, fast, agile, deadly. Its sleek shape and 20mm cannons made it one of the most advanced fighters in the world. They also had the Heinkel He 11-1 and Dornier Do-17 bombers, designed to bring death from the sky. The British had fewer planes, but their pilots flew with a burning resolve. The Supermarine Spitfire, swift, elegant, and deadly, was Britain's pride. Its elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it unmatched speed and maneuverability. Alongside it flew the Hawker Hurricane, rugged and reliable, the workhorse of the RAF. Together they formed Fighter Command, the shield of Britain. July 10th, 1940. The battle begins. At 4:40 in the morning, the first warning came over the radar screens. A cluster of blips, small at first, then multiplying. The signal operators called it in. The order flashed through the command network, from headquarters to sector stations. The loudspeakers on the airfields erupted, "Scramble! Scramble!" Pilots sprinted from their ready rooms. Engines roared to life. Wheels lifted from grass runways, the Battle of Britain had begun. The German raids started with attacks on shipping in the Channel. Convoys of British merchant vessels became targets for bombers, escorted by squadrons of 109s. At first, the RAF struggled to adapt. Communications were strained, fuel supplies thin. But as the days turned into weeks, the defense network grew sharper. Radar sightings fed into Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where massive maps tracked the enemy's every move. The result was revolutionary, a real-time air defense system, the first in history. The first clashes high above the clouds, the first duels of the Battle of Britain unfolded. Pilot Officer Peter Brothers, flying a Hurricane, recalled, "You didn't see the Germans until they were on you." Suddenly the sky was full of aircraft, crossing and twisting, tracers flying like red sparks. The air vibrated with chaos. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the flash of sunlight on spinning metal. When a bomber went down, its black smoke curled into the summer sky like a wound. When a Spitfire fell, it plunged in silence, leaving only a trail of fire. The RAF learned fast. The 109s had the edge in climb speed, but limited fuel, only 15 minutes of combat time over England before they had to turn back. The British used that to their advantage. Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, organized the defense into sectors, each coordinated by radar and ground controllers. It was Dowding's system, his Dowding system, that would save Britain. Fear and fire. For the people below, the war was no longer distant. The thunder of engines shook the skies. Children pointed upward, thinking the silver dots were stars in daylight. Sometimes the wreckage rained down onto farms and towns. At night, searchlights swept the heavens like ghostly fingers, and anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly into the darkness. Britain held its breath. The Luftwaffe's plan. In Berlin, Hermann Göring, the flamboyant commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his air force would destroy the RAF in 4 weeks. He boasted of overwhelming superiority. By mid-August, the Germans shifted focus to Britain's airfields and radar installations. The goal was clear: annihilate Fighter Command. Hundreds of bombers crossed the Channel daily, escorted by swarms of 109s. Airfields at Biggin Hill, Kenley, Tangmere, names that would become legend, were pounded with bombs. Every day, the RAF scrambled what it had left. Mechanics worked through the night to patch bullet holes, replace engines, and refuel. Pilots slept in their cockpits between sorties. Losses were mounting. Britain was bleeding. Voices from the Skyflight Lieutenant Geoffrey Wellham, one of the youngest Spitfire pilots at just 19, later wrote in his diary, "You climb into that cockpit, close the canopy, and suddenly the world narrows to the gun sight and the noise of your engine. You're terrified, but there's no time for fear." He had flown 6 sorties in one day. Each time, fewer planes returned. Fire over the Channel, the sea below became a graveyard of aircraft. Burning wrecks floated among oil slicks, the bodies of pilots, friend and foe, claimed by the waves. For the RAF, every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Training new ones took months, and there were not enough aircraft to go around. But still they flew, because behind them lay Britain, its cities, its people, its future. London. Waits in the capital, life continued under threat of the unknown. Air raid shelters were built in gardens. The underground tunnels became nightly refugees. Newspapers carried photos of smiling pilots, nicknamed the Few, though the public had little idea of the scale of the battle raging above them. Each evening, radio bulletins listed the number of enemy planes destroyed. The tone was optimistic, but behind the statistics lay exhaustion. Churchill visited Fighter Command one afternoon. He watched as squadrons were directed into battle from the operations room. A giant map, pins moving as reports came in. As he left, he whispered to his aide, almost in tears, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those words would soon echo across the world. On the first turning point. By late August, the Luftwaffe was growing frustrated. They had destroyed several airfields, but not broken fighter command. Radar towers damaged one day were repaired by the next. The Germans realized they couldn't crush the RAF easily. And so, in a decision that would change the course of history, they shifted tactics again. After a small British raid bombed Berlin, Hitler was enraged. He ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London directly. The Blitz was about to begin. The summer of 1940 had barely faded when the skies over Britain darkened again, not with clouds, but with the shadow of hundreds of German bombers. For months, the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the Royal Air Force in its airfields. Now Hitler turned to a new plan: to break Britain's will by terror from the sky. London, the heart of the empire, would burn. It began on the evening of September 7th, 1940. The sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, small, defiant glimmers of normality. Then came the droning sound. At first it was distant, like the hum of approaching thunder. But within minutes the sound grew into a deafening roar. Civilians looked up from the streets, from pubs, from their dinner tables, and saw the night filled with moving stars. They weren't stars. They were planes. Hundreds of them. The first bombs fell on the London docks. The explosions rippled through the city, lighting up the Thames like molten fire. Warehouses burst into flames. Fuel tanks exploded. Glass rained from shattered windows. The people of London ran for cover, some into shelters, some into the underground tunnels that would soon become their nightly refuge. From that night onward, the Blitz had begun. Night after night, for months, German bombers returned. The Luftwaffe's goal was simple: to crush the morale of the British people, to destroy the industrial and logistical heart of the island, and to prepare for the invasion that never came. Yet in those first nights of horror, something remarkable happened. London did not break. The people, ordinary men, women, and children, emerged from the rubble each morning, brushed the dust from their coats, and carried on. Milkmen delivered bottles through streets lined with craters. Bus drivers navigated detours around smoldering ruins. Even in the face of destruction, life went on. Inside the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Prime Minister Winston Churchill watched the reports come in. Whole neighborhoods destroyed, hundreds dead, thousands homeless. Yet when he visited the ruins the next morning, people cheered him as if he were their protector. He turned to his aide and muttered, "They are the lion. I am merely privileged to roar for them." The British response was not just courage, it was coordination. The Royal Observer Corps tracked incoming formations, radar stations picked up signals, and Fighter Command scrambled interceptors to harass the bombers whenever possible. Though the RAF was exhausted, they refused to cede the skies completely. Pilots like those from the Polish 303 Squadron, Czech, Canadian, and New Zealand squadrons joined the British flyers, adding their skill and fury to the defense. Each night, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. One night, they bombed the docks. Another night, industrial plants or rail yards. Then they began to strike the very heart of London, St. Paul's Cathedral, Buckingham Palace, Parliament itself. Firefighters battled for hours among collapsing buildings. The sound of anti-aircraft guns filled the night, punctuated by the whistle of bombs and the cries of those trapped beneath rubble. For children, the Blitz was both terrifying and strangely normal. They slept in shelters, clutching gas masks like teddy bears. Mothers sang lullabies to drown out the explosions. In the morning, they queued for rations, shared jokes, and told themselves the same thing. We're still here. But the cost was immense. Between September 1940 and May 1941, more than 40,000 civilians would die in Britain, most of them in London. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and other cities were also hit brutally. Coventry, once known for its medieval beauty, was flattened in a single night of bombing that created a firestorm so intense it melted steel. The ruins of Coventry Cathedral became a symbol of sacrifice and endurance. In the skies above, the RAF continued to fight. Pilots flew into flak-filled darkness, often without radar, guided only by spotlights or the glow of burning cities. Many never returned. Those who did came back to find their airfields bombed or their barracks destroyed. Yet they climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes again the next night. The Luftwaffe's bombers, meanwhile, began to suffer heavier losses. Britain's night fighter units grew more effective, radar improved, and anti-aircraft defenses became deadlier. Pilots like John Cunningham, nicknamed Cat's Eyes, learned to hunt bombers by the faintest glimmer of moonlight or the echo of a radar signal. Hitler had hoped that by pounding Britain into submission, Churchill would sue for peace. Instead, the opposite happened. The more bombs that fell, the more defiant the British became. In one of his famous radio addresses, Churchill's gravelly voice rang out through the crackling static. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The speech was played in air raid shelters and over crackling radios across the nation. It was not just rhetoric, it was survival. The people drew strength from it, from him and from each other. By winter, the Blitz had become routine. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky each night, anti-aircraft guns thundered, and people slept underground in the damp tunnels of the underground. Artists painted murals on the walls, bands played to lift spirits. Even weddings were held in the depths of the stations. Above ground, wardens patrolled the blacked-out streets, shouting, "Put that light out," whenever a curtain wasn't fully drawn. Any glimmer of light could guide enemy bombers to their targets. The darkness was total, so complete that even stars seemed dimmer. Despite the horror, strange moments of beauty appeared. When bombs fell on St. Paul's Cathedral, fire crews fought desperately to save it. The next morning, a photograph appeared on the front page of newspapers across the world. St. Paul's, standing tall, wreathed in smoke and fire, unbroken. It became the image of London's soul, scarred but undefeated. But as 1941 began, the Luftwaffe shifted its attention eastward. Hitler's eyes turned to a new target, the Soviet Union. The nightly raids on Britain continued for a time, but the intensity waned. The German High Command believed that Britain was effectively neutralized. They were wrong. Because, while the Blitz had failed to destroy Britain, it had forged something unbreakable, a sense of unity, of defiance, of quiet courage that would carry the British people through the darkest years of the war. When the fires finally stopped, the ruins of London smoked beneath a pale spring sun. Children emerged from shelters to play among the rubble. Men and women picked up hammers and began rebuilding their homes. Churchill visited the city once more, standing among the ashes of a bombed street. "We shall rise again," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. And Britain did. By the spring of 1941, the skies over Britain were calmer, but the echoes of war still rumbled like distant thunder. The Blitz had scarred cities, broken homes, and taken thousands of lives, yet the spirit of defiance remained unbroken. For the Royal Air Force, this was not the end. It was the beginning of a counterstrike that would change the balance of power in the air war over Europe. The pilots who had once fought desperately for survival during the Battle of Britain were no longer on the defensive. They had learned, adapted, and hardened. The young men who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes now did so with a new sense of mastery. The Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority, and Britain had survived. The island fortress stood, defiant and alive, ready to strike back. The shift began with strategy. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who had orchestrated the defense during the Battle of Britain, was replaced by Sir William Sholto Douglas, a man who believed in taking the fight to the enemy. Britain's air campaign turned from defense to offense. No longer would the RAF simply wait for the bombers to come. They would cross the channel themselves. The Royal Air Force began mounting daylight raids on enemy shipping, radar stations, and industrial targets along the French coast. These early missions were costly. German fighters still dominated the skies over Europe, and RAF losses were heavy. Yet, with each raid, the British learned valuable lessons about formation flying, fuel management, and target coordination. Slowly, painfully, they began to claw back the initiative. The British aircraft industry, battered but unbroken, continued to innovate. Engineers worked tirelessly to refine the Spitfire, giving it more range, better armament, and superior speed. The Hurricane, though aging, was modified for ground attack and night interception. Then came new designs. The Mosquito, a twin-engine marvel made largely of wood, capable of outrunning enemy fighters and striking deep behind enemy lines. The Mosquito would soon become one of the most effective and versatile aircraft of the entire war. Meanwhile, in the factories and hangars across Britain, the people, men and women alike, labored day and night. The munitionettes, as they were called, worked with steady hands, assembling engines, welding fuselages, and fitting wings. Their work was as vital as the pilot's courage. Every bolt tightened, every bullet packed, every plane rolled out of the factory floor was a quiet act of defiance against the Axis. In the skies, new faces joined the battle. Young Americans, impatient for their own country to join the war, crossed the Atlantic to volunteer for the Royal Air Force. They became the Eagle Squadrons, flying alongside British, Canadian, Polish, and Czech pilots. They were bold, often reckless, but their presence symbolized something greater, the beginning of a new alliance that would soon shift the global balance of power. On the German side, the situation was changing too. The Luftwaffe had overextended itself. With Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, vast numbers of German aircraft and crews were redeployed to the Eastern Front. The skies over Britain grew quieter, but the threat was far from over. The Luftwaffe still launched raids on ports, industrial centers, and the occasional daring daylight assault. Yet for the first time, Britain had breathing room, a chance to rebuild, rearm, and plan. Within the intelligence community, a quiet revolution was unfolding. At Bletchley Park, a sprawling estate north of London, a group of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to crack the German Enigma code. Among them was a young mathematician named Alan Turing. His breakthroughs in deciphering Enigma messages gave the British command precious insight into Luftwaffe operations. With this information, the RAF could anticipate attacks, adjust fighter patrols, and strike targets with uncanny precision. As the months passed, British morale began to lift. The radio broadcasts, the nightly sirens, and even the blackout routines became part of life's rhythm. People joked that if they heard no bombs, they couldn't sleep properly. It was dark humor, but it kept them sane. Then came the first signs that the tide was turning. RAF bombers began hitting targets in occupied Europe. Rail yards, airfields, shipyards, and factories producing weapons for the German war machine. These early raids were small compared to what would come later, but their psychological impact was immense. For the first time, the British people could look up at the night sky and know that their planes were bringing the war to Germany. In July 1941, Churchill addressed the nation once again. "This is not the end," he said. "It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning." His words captured the moment perfectly. The worst was over, but victory was still far away. Life in Britain, though still under siege, began to recover. Children evacuated to the countryside during the Blitz started returning home. Bomb sites were cleared, and construction began on new housing. Women filled the roles left vacant by men at the front, driving buses, running factories, even serving as anti-aircraft gunners and radar operators. Britain was transforming itself into a nation of total war, where every citizen had a role to play. In the air, technology advanced rapidly. The first operational radar-controlled night fighter systems were introduced, giving British pilots a new advantage in intercepting German bombers. The introduction of airborne radar turned the tables during night raids, allowing the RAF to hunt instead of merely defend. For the Luftwaffe, the losses began to mount. German pilots who once flew confidently across the Channel now faced increasing resistance. British fighters struck with precision, often guided by intelligence decoded from Enigma transmissions. The Germans began to feel what the British had endured the previous year: the tension, the exhaustion, the creeping sense of futility. As autumn approached, the Royal Air Force launched circus operations, daylight bomber raids designed to lure German fighters into combat. These were dangerous missions, but they forced the Luftwaffe to fight on British terms. The Germans, spread thin between the Eastern Front and the defense of Western Europe, found themselves increasingly overmatched. Meanwhile, in secret planning rooms, the British air staff began preparing something even larger: a strategic bombing campaign that would one day strike the heart of Germany itself. The foundations of Bomber Command's future offensive were being laid in those months of 1941. The idea was simple but devastating. If the Luftwaffe could not destroy Britain from the air, perhaps Britain could destroy Germany the same way. For the pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain, these were bittersweet times. Many of their comrades were gone, their names now etched on plaques in village halls or on the walls of air bases. Yet those who remained knew that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The skies over Britain, once filled with enemy bombers, now belonged to them. By the end of 1941, the balance had shifted. Britain was no longer fighting alone. The United States, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, entered the war. The vast industrial power of America would soon flow across the Atlantic: planes, tanks, ships, supplies. The partnership between Britain and America would form the backbone of the Allied victory that was still years away but now finally within reach. And as British pilots looked across the Channel from their airfields on the southern coast, they knew that one day they would fly back, not to defend, but to liberate. The long, dark night of fear had begun to give way to a dawn of hope. The year was 1942, and Britain stood taller than it had in years. The fires of the Blitz had cooled, the smog of war still hung over London, but the nation had survived. Across airfields in the countryside, the steady rumble of engines marked a new chapter in the air war, a chapter no longer of defense, but of retribution. The Royal Air Force, once battered and bloodied, had transformed into a force of vengeance. The enemy that had once rained destruction on British cities would now taste the same from the skies above Germany. This was no longer the desperate resistance of 1940. This was calculated, relentless, and growing stronger by the day. Under the command of Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, known to history as Bomber Harris, the RAF began its great campaign of strategic bombing. Harris was a hard man with an iron sense of purpose. He believed that war could be won not only on the battlefield but in the factories, rail yards, and cities that sustained the enemy's war machine. The Germans sowed the wind, he declared. Now they are going to reap the whirlwind. From the sprawling bomber bases scattered across Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and Cambridgeshire, waves of heavy bombers, Wellingtons, Stirlings, Halifaxes, and the mighty Avro Lancasters took to the skies. Their destination, the industrial heart of Germany. Their mission, to break the will of a nation that had once believed itself invincible. The first large-scale raids were brutal and costly. In the darkness, crews navigated by dead reckoning and primitive radio beacons. Flak guns filled the skies with fire, and night fighters prowled like wolves. Entire squadrons were sometimes lost before reaching their targets. But each mission taught the RAF new lessons. Crews learned to fly tighter formations, to use electronic countermeasures, to find targets with new radar systems like H-2S. The war in the air was evolving into something vast and impersonal, a conflict fought by machines and technology, but fueled by human endurance. The men who flew these bombers were young, often barely out of school. They lived hard and died young. In the mess halls, they sang songs and shared jokes, but every empty chair at breakfast told the truth that few spoke aloud. And yet, they went up again, night after night, because they believed in something, because they remembered Coventry, London, and the children who had slept in the underground as bombs fell above them. Each mission was their answer. The raids grew larger and more sophisticated. On May 30th, 1942, the RAF launched its first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. The operation was a demonstration of Britain's growing strength, 1,000 aircraft roaring across the Channel in a single night. The skies above Germany burned bright as entire districts of Cologne were engulfed in flames. The raid shocked the world. For the first time, the war had turned decisively against Germany in the air. But the cost was terrible. Out of the 1,000 planes that took off, 41 never returned. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. For every bomber that fell, 7 men vanished into the dark waters of the North Sea or the smoking fields of Europe. Yet the message was clear. Germany was no longer safe. In response, the Luftwaffe scrambled to defend its cities. Searchlights swept the skies, flak batteries thundered, and night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 stalked the bombers. The Germans introduced radar defenses and deceptive lighting patterns to confuse navigators. The battle between bomber and defender became a deadly game of innovation and counter-innovation. Inside Britain, the home front felt the pressure too. The bomber offensive demanded enormous resources: steel, fuel, manpower. Factories worked around the clock, women assembling engines, loading ammunition, sewing parachutes. The blackouts returned, but now the darkness was not from fear of attack. It was to hide the bombers that launched into the night. In the pubs near airfields, the crews gathered before missions, sipping beer in silence. Some wrote letters home, sealed and labeled, to be opened in the event of my death. Others laughed and sang, pretending they weren't terrified. When the siren wailed, they donned their gear, sheepskin jackets, helmets, oxygen masks, and climbed into their aircraft. The engines roared to life, one by one, until the airfield trembled. Then they took off into the blackness. For those who stayed behind, the wait was agony. Hours passed, then dawn crept over the horizon. The roar of returning bombers signaled another night survived. Ground crews counted them in: 10 planes out, 7 back, 5 back, sometimes only 2. The survivors stepped out, exhausted, eyes red from the glare of flak and fire. They said little. They didn't need to. In Germany, the raids were devastating. Cities like Essen, Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin were hit repeatedly. The industrial Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of German production, became a landscape of twisted steel and smoldering ruins. Workers labored in the rubble. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single night. The German propaganda machine called it terror bombing, but in truth, it was the same terror they had unleashed on Britain 2 years earlier. Still, for all the destruction, the bombing campaign was far from perfect. Accuracy was poor, and many bombs fell far from their intended targets. Entire towns were wiped out by mistake. Even within Britain, there were those who questioned the morality of the campaign. Some asked whether killing civilians would really shorten the war, or only harden the enemy's resolve. Churchill himself wrestled with the dilemma. He understood the strategic need, but he also understood the moral cost. In his private moments, he was haunted by the images of cities burning, images not unlike those he had seen in London. But he believed, as did his commanders, that it was necessary. "We are fighting for survival," he told his advisors, "and survival has no rules." By late 1942, the balance of power in the skies had shifted even further. The United States had joined the war, bringing with it a new dimension to the air campaign. The U.S. 8th Air Force, flying the mighty B-17 Flying Fortress, began conducting daylight raids while the RAF struck by night. Together they formed a relentless, around-the-clock assault on the German war machine. The Germans were caught in a nightmare that never ended. Daytime precision raids from the Americans, nighttime saturation bombing from the British. Factories that survived the day were destroyed by night. The once invincible Luftwaffe now struggled to defend its own homeland. In the midst of this air war, new tactics emerged. One of the most daring came in 1943, when the RAF launched Operation Chastise, better known as the Dam Busters Raid. Using specially designed bouncing bombs, a squadron of Lancaster bombers attacked the great dams of the Ruhr Valley. The bombs skipped across the water, struck the dam walls, and exploded deep underwater. The resulting floods devastated German industry and power supplies. It was a feat of precision, flying, courage, and ingenuity that captured the world's imagination. The success of the Dambusters raid showed that technology and daring could achieve what sheer numbers could not. It gave hope to the air crews who faced impossible odds each night. It also proved that the British spirit of innovation was as potent as ever. But even as Britain struck deeper and harder, the losses mounted. Bomber Command's casualty rate remained staggering. 1 in every 3 airmen would not survive the war. Some squadrons lost entire crews in a single week. The faces in the photographs on mess walls changed constantly. Still, they flew. Because they had to. Because stopping meant surrendering everything they had fought for since 1940. And because every time they looked up at the sky, they remembered that once those same skies had burned over their homes. By 1943, the strategic bombing campaign had become the backbone of Britain's war effort. It tied down vast German resources, disrupted production, and weakened morale. Yet it also revealed the terrible truth of modern war, that victory came not only through courage, but through destruction. In the ashes of those bombed cities, the shape of the post-war world was already being forged. The skies that once belonged to Germany now belonged to the Allies, and though the war still raged on land and sea, one fact was clear. The tide had turned. By the dawn of 1944, the sound of war had become as familiar to Britain as the morning birds. But now it was no longer the enemy's engines that echoed across the sky, it was theirs. The thunder of Allied bombers filled the night as thousands of planes soared eastward toward the heart of Hitler's empire. Each flight carried with it the weight of vengeance, the hope of victory, and the ghosts of those who never returned. Britain had risen from the ashes of the Blitz and transformed into a fortress of industry and resolve. Every field, every hangar, every factory hummed with purpose. The war had united the island as never before. From the smog-filled docks of London to the quiet villages of Yorkshire, everyone knew that the moment of reckoning was near. The Allies were preparing for something unprecedented, the liberation of Europe. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was taking shape in utmost secrecy. The skies would play a crucial role in its success. Before a single soldier could set foot on French soil, the air had to be conquered completely. Germany's ability to resist had to be shattered from above. The task fell to the combined might of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces. Together, they launched a relentless campaign against German transport networks, airfields, radar installations, and military production sites. It was called the Transportation Plan, an all-out effort to paralyze the Nazi war machine. Night and day, the skies roared with engines. British Lancasters and Halifaxes flew in massive formations under the moonlight, their bomb bays filled with high explosives and incendiaries. By day, American B-17 and B-24s streaked across the blue, striking rail yards, oil refineries, and aircraft factories with deadly precision. The air over Europe became a continuous battlefield. German defenses fought back fiercely. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, was still deadly. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore into the bomber formations, while flak batteries turned the air into a deadly storm of shrapnel. The Allied crews pressed on through the fire, their planes riddled with holes, their engines sputtering, their comrades falling in flames. Many never returned, and yet for every bomber shot down, 2 more took its place. The Allied air fleet seemed endless, a tide of steel and courage that refused to break. Slowly, inexorably, Germany's capacity to wage war from the air began to crumble. The once mighty Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, its fuel supplies dwindling, its pilots outnumbered and exhausted. By early 1944, the balance had shifted completely. The Allies ruled the skies. German cities burned nightly, their factories reduced to twisted ruins. The war that Germany had once unleashed upon Europe had come full circle. The hunters had become the hunted. The British public, though weary after years of sacrifice, could sense that victory was approaching. In London, ration lines were long, but spirits were high. The radio crackled with Churchill's words, "The hour of our greatest effort is approaching. Let us go forward together with our united strength." Meanwhile, in the secret planning rooms of southern England, preparations for D-Day were reaching fever pitch. Pilots pored over maps of the French coast, memorizing every road, river, and village. Paratroopers trained for night drops behind enemy lines. Engineers designed floating harbors and amphibious tanks. And above it all, the bombers and fighters of the RAF prepared to open the way. Before the invasion, the Allies launched a deception campaign of their own, Operation Fortitude. Fake radio transmissions, inflatable tanks, and phantom divisions convinced the Germans that the landings would come at Calais, not Normandy. The Luftwaffe, unable to patrol effectively, failed to uncover the ruse. The ghosts of the earlier deception campaigns, like the fake armies of Operation Mincemeat and the Ghost Army, were alive again, shaping the greatest operation in history. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. At dawn, the horizon over the English Channel blazed with ships, planes, and fire. Thousands of Allied aircraft filled the sky, strafing German positions, bombing defenses, and clearing the way for the invasion fleet. The RAF and USAAF flew over 14,000 sorties that day alone. The beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword erupted in chaos and heroism. As British, American, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches, the airmen above them fought to keep the skies clear. Dogfights erupted across northern France as Allied fighters clashed with the remnants of the Luftwaffe. In one day, air supremacy was achieved so decisively that German reinforcements were unable to reach the front. The invasion succeeded because the skies belonged to the Allies. For the air crews who had fought since 1940, D-Day was more than a victory. It was vindication. They had endured the Blitz, the long nights of terror, and the endless missions into enemy fire. Now they were no longer fighting for survival, but for liberation. As the Allied armies advanced across France, the bombers followed, striking bridges, railways, and retreating columns. By autumn, Paris was free. The tide of war had turned irrevocably against Germany. The once invincible Reich was now fighting on all fronts, its cities in ruins, its armies retreating. Yet the war was not over. Hitler's regime refused to surrender. The bombing intensified. In late 1944, the Allies launched raids of unprecedented scale on Berlin, Dresden, and other cities deep inside Germany. The destruction was total. The glow of burning cities lit the night sky for hundreds of miles. The same fire that had once consumed London now consumed the heart of the Third Reich. Inside the bombers, the crews were haunted by what they saw. Below them, entire cities became seas of fire. They told themselves it was necessary, that every bomb brought the war closer to its end. But the images stayed with them. The faces they never saw. The children who, like their own back home, had once played in the streets now reduced to ash. War had become a storm that spared no one. On the ground in Germany, the people endured what the British once had. They huddled in basements, listening to the thunder above, praying for dawn. And when dawn came, it revealed only smoke, ruin, and silence. By 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine. The Red Army closed in from the east. Hitler, hiding in his bunker beneath Berlin, issued orders to ghosts. Above him, the roar of Allied bombers was constant. The sky itself had become the symbol of his defeat. In April, as Soviet troops entered the capital, the last RAF and American missions struck Berlin. The city that had once stood as the center of Nazi power now lay in ruins. Fires raged where parades had once marched. The airmen who looked down from their bombers knew that the war was ending. On May 8, 1945, the guns fell silent. Victory in Europe was declared. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus. The air was filled not with the sound of sirens, but with laughter. Flags waved, bells rang, and strangers embraced in the streets. For the first time in 6 years, Britain was free from fear. In the skies above, squadrons of Spitfires and Lancasters flew in formation over London, a final salute to the nation they had defended. The people looked up, their eyes following the contrails as they faded into the distance. The war had been won, but at a cost beyond measure. Nearly 55,000 airmen of Bomber Command had lost their lives. Young men who never saw the peace they fought for. Their courage had saved Europe, but it had also scarred a generation. In the quiet that followed, Britain began to rebuild once more. The bombed-out streets of London were filled with the sound of hammers and laughter. The country that had stood alone in 1940 now stood among victors. And through it all, the memory of the Battle of Britain, the summer when the fate of the world hung in the balance, endured. For it was in those skies, in those desperate months, that freedom itself had been saved. When the war finally ended, Europe was a landscape of shattered cities, silent fields, and exhausted nations. The smoke had cleared, the guns had fallen quiet, and the world, still trembling from 6 years of devastation, stepped slowly into peace. But the sky, once filled with flames and steel, remained the place where the fate of freedom had been decided. The men who had defended Britain in 1940, when the island stood alone against tyranny, returned home to a world that barely understood what they had done. They had fought at altitudes where frost formed inside their oxygen masks, where the sun rose above the curve of the earth, where the difference between life and death was the blink of an eye. They were the few. The history books recorded their victories, but the true weight of their courage lived in memories no written word could fully carry: the howl of engines at full throttle, the flash of tracer fire across the wings, the thundering silence when a friend did not return. The Battle of Britain had not only saved a nation, it had saved the future itself. Had the RAF fallen, had the Luftwaffe gained control of the skies, Britain would have been invaded. Europe would have been sealed beneath the grip of fascism. The resistance movements would have died in darkness. There would have been no D-Day, no liberation of Paris, no hope of reclaiming the continent. The world would have been reshaped in shadow. But the RAF did not fall. The pilots who rose into the sky in their Spitfires and Hurricanes carved a line in the clouds, a line no enemy ever crossed. Their victory ensured that the torch of freedom would not be extinguished, and they were not alone. The colossal bombing campaigns that followed, the relentless strikes against German factories, rail networks, and oil reserves, these brought the Third Reich to its knees. Every pilot who sat in a Lancaster bomber over the Ruhr, every crewman who braved flak and burning cities, helped dismantle the Nazi war machine piece by piece. Their sacrifices were immense. 1 in 3 of those young airmen never came home. Their average age was just 22. Their names are carved into memorials across Britain: Runnymede, Coningsby, Lincoln, London, etched in stone so that time may never erase them. The legacy of the airmen was not only written in loss, but in what they preserved: freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to live without fear. The world that rose after the war rebuilt cities, new nations, a United Nations, a Europe determined never again to fall to tyranny, was a world shaped by their defense of the sky. The aircraft they flew became legends. The Spitfire, sleek, elegant, deadly, would become a symbol of hope itself. The Lancaster, massive, rugged, resilient, became the hammer that shattered the Reich. The Hurricane, loyal, sturdy, unyielding, became the quiet hero of the skies. But it was never the machines that won the war. It was the men inside them. Men who strapped themselves into cockpits knowing they might never return. Men who looked death in the face at sunrise and climbed anyway. In the decades that followed, as the world healed and grew, the veterans aged into old men. Their hair grayed, their hands trembled, their voices softened. But when they spoke of those days, the battle cries of Spitfires rolling into the sun, their eyes carried the fire of youth again. They remembered the sky. They remembered the friends who did not return. They remembered the moment they changed the world, and the world at last remembered them. Today, the sound of a Merlin engine still echoes at air shows across Britain. When a Spitfire arcs across the sky in the sunlight, people stop. They look up. They listen. And for a moment, time folds inward. The summer of 1940 lives again. A reminder, a promise, a warning that freedom is never guaranteed, that courage is never outdated, that heroes do not always walk, they fly. The Battle of Britain was not merely a military victory. It was the moment when ordinary men proved that the sky belonged not to tyrants, but to the brave. And because of them, Europe was saved, the world was changed, and freedom endured. The sky is quiet now, but the echoes remain forever.